I am told before I start that I need to give you the fire drill. I'm echoing a bit. Am I supposed to echo quite as much as that? Ah, right. See if that helps. Yes, okay. In the event of a fire, the exits are there. No wings to be climbed over. It's great fun seeing you this morning because what Bishop Gully didn't tell you was that in my first life, I trained to be an actor. And seeing so many of you today took me way back to a terrible time when I went with a... Stopped altogether now, yep. I went with a touring company to a vast space which held 1,000 people. And we had 13 people in the audience and 6 people after the interval. And the next night they were sold out for All in Wrestling. So that did us a lot of good. Very good for the humility. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. Happy Shrove Tuesday, but more to this morning's point, happy St. David's Day. But when I wrote all this, the situation in Ukraine hadn't yet really arisen. And I want to say that in this first talk, which is called Keep the Faith, I think we can take real inspiration from the people and the leadership that we see in Ukraine at the moment, particularly their president, who when he was elected said, "I will never let you down. I will never let you down." And my goodness, isn't he an inspiration for all of us at the moment? So as we look at this first talk, as we enter this holy sabbatical, let us remember Jesus who never let us down. And remember perhaps the calling to each one of us to try as hard as we can not to let Jesus or our people down. But it's to St. David we look today, to the 6th century monk and founder of monasteries, St. David, that we turn this morning, hopefully for inspiration. Our 3 talks are based on words from his last sermon when he directed his congregation to be joyful, keep the faith, and do the little things. We've changed the order and one of the titles slightly this morning. We will begin, as I said, with keep the faith, then ask, what does it mean to do the little things well, and finish with, be joyful. But when I approached these 3 titles, I asked myself what it was for me that was the thread between all 3. And the phrase that came to me was, pay attention. Pay attention to keeping the faith. Pay attention to the little things. Pay attention and you will rejoice. We pay attention by listening as much as we can to what God is saying to us, by leaning into it, rather than when it is difficult, instinctively running away to protect ourselves from uncertainty, fear, or pain, or running faster and faster to try to keep up, to be more organized and efficient, so that we look as though we're able to cope. But please note, we have to pay attention. It costs, because it takes time, energy, and a giving up of the comforting illusion of self-reliance, our belief in our own autonomy. It is costly because we have to learn to stand with empty hands and seemingly waste time. It is costly because we would so much prefer to numb ourselves with distractions. And you all know which is your particular distraction that you turn to when you want to numb yourself. Mine is solitaire. And I want quite unapologetically to mention at this point a certain way of praying, and that is the way of contemplative prayer. By that, I mean the daily habit of sitting in silence, and as the poet R.S. Thomas put it, waiting for the God to speak. This stilling of heart and mind before God, if practiced, allows us to slow down and to be much more present to God's voice in our lives, not just at the moment of prayer, but inside us. We have it and we go out into the world amid all the hustle and bustle of our lives, and it's there with us all day as a place to return to when life becomes too much. It helps us to be present. It helps us to be proactive rather than reactive. It helps us to support everyone we meet in their journeys. Here's the story. A man is invited to a party on a boat. It's a good party. You just go, drink, food. They chug out of the harbour as the sun is going down, and he's having a really good time, but it's all getting a bit hot, so he decides he's going to go out on deck for a breather. But he misses his footing, and he falls into the sea. And of course, because the boat is loud music and he went out on his own, nobody realises. And he watches as the boat goes further and further away. He yells, he screams, he waves his arms. Of course, nobody hears him. And he watches this boat disappearing. And of course, he's panicking. And he's treading water. And he's absolutely desperate, and he's getting more and more tired. And suddenly he remembers that when he did swimming classes, somebody said to him, "You will last much longer if you turn on your back and float." So he does that. He turns on his back, and he puts his arms out, and he puts his head out back, and he floats. Of course, he's still panicking. All these thoughts are going on in his mind. But after time, he begins to see what's above him. The stars in the sky, the moon. He begins to realize that he is this tiny point in time, looking up into the vast history of the universe. Those stars that are now dead stars, those stars that are new stars. And here he is, this tiny, tiny creature. And he begins to wonder at this. And as he lies there, he begins to calm down, particularly when he feels the water holding him. And he begins to breathe in and out as the waves go up and down. And gradually, very gradually, he becomes aware of this extraordinary presence holding him, supporting him, looking after him. And he realizes that it doesn't matter if he lives or dies. He's being held. He floats there for hours. And then he sees the lights of the boat coming back to find him, tracking up and down. And wonder of wonders, miracle it has to be. They see him. They pick him out of the water. He bursts into tears. He gets hot soup, food, dry clothes. And eventually he goes to his tiny little cabin to sleep. But on that day, that night, and for all time to come, he he knows that one of the most important things that ever happened to him was when he fell off the side of the boat into the sea. Now, for many of us, COVID has been a bit like falling off the boat into the sea. How have we kept the faith when our churches were closed, our lives were stripped back to nothing, when we could not celebrate the Eucharist or meet together for prayer, when we were not allowed to visit the sick in hospital or our desperately lonely parishioners? And how are we on the other side of the worst of it? At least we hope the other side of the worst of it. Our lives have been changed. Our church has been changed. I would say forever, when we see how we've learnt to function over the last 2 years. But we're still anxious because we're anxious about stewardship, falling congregation numbers, structures, and like everyone now, the rising cost of living, which is going to get worse with this terrible war that we see every day, climate change, everything is there to make us afraid. Keeping the faith at its most basic level is remaining in the vine by first paying attention to our own relationship with God through prayer, by nurturing our own spiritual growth in whatever way works for us. Jesus looked after his spiritual relationship with God first, listened to his Father first, sought guidance and understanding from his Father first. Jesus knew what he later tried to teach us. Without me, without the Father, you can do nothing. If your larder is empty, you have nothing to offer anyone else. So keeping the faith is keeping our larder stocked by meeting with God in prayer, meeting with God in the stuff that nurtures us, and listening. Some of us, I realise, have had our faith seriously knocked by the pandemic. How do you keep the faith then? 2 people who are in senior lay positions in the church I attend have had depression for the last 2 or 3 months and are avoiding church. And I know that when I'm down, I don't want to pray. I'm bleak, angry, full of self-loathing, and I don't want to face God like that. But this is, of course, exactly the moment when we should turn to Christ. And every time I've done it, sometimes forced to do it because I had no other choice, every time I've done it in my times of direst need, God has been there, not protecting me from the situation. He didn't take it away ever, not ever. But he sustained me through it. And there was always a point of metanoia, a point where everything turned upside down. And I saw it from a different angle, which was so clear and so potent that I knew that it was God's way being given to me to look at it. Incidentally, when that happens, you're always given the actions that go with the experience. What do I do next? We need to ask ourselves when we are in darkness, and some of you will be like that today, I know. We need to ask, where do we turn? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that we need to turn back to the person of Jesus Christ, to the divine truth, as he called him, because we know the truth when we see it. When we turn back to Jesus himself, we usually recognize the truth. And if we find we can trust that truth again, then hope soon follows. St. John of the Cross said that hope had to do with memory. When I look back over my life, I can see how I've been supported and sustained, held by God's grace. When I look back through everything, including some times of terrible darkness, sometimes when I was a first parish priest, when I used to lock myself in the church, I'd have had a lovely time in here, and I would walk up and down the main aisle raging at God. I've been a priest since you were first allowed to be priests, and when I got my first job, no male priest would touch it because the church was in such a bad way. And I raged at God. And like a good parent, he just sat there and listened till I didn't have any energy left. But I see now how I was always supported. There was often loss of faith in myself, but God has been there, the ground of my being. But beware, says St. John, of the cross, beware of letting memory of what has been dictate how things should look now. In our life of prayer, St. John says, there must be a letting go. Our tendency is to think that we must repeat things that have been helpful in the past, but that closes us down to what God is saying to us now. The past, now. Brave new world. In our present situation, St. John's words remind us that we're not to try to make things as they were. We're not here to repeat the church of 2.5 years ago, but to listen to what God is saying to us now. We hope for what we cannot yet see, said St. Paul. Jürgen Moltmann took that thought and wrote, Christianity is hope forward-looking and forward-moving, and therefore also revolutionizing and transforming the present. So here, now, as we sit here this morning in this place, God is transforming the future, our future, in this moment. One of my favorite sayings comes from the poetry of R.S. Thomas. He wrote, "The cross is always avant-garde," meaning new and seemingly experimental, taking us to strange, unexpected places. And I think this is where we are now, post-pandemic. We are in liminal space, like standing in a doorway and looking back at where we've come from, which is the room that we know and we were comfortable in, and looking forward into a room that is strange and is not yet our own. And it isn't a comfortable place to be, liminal space, because you're neither one nor the other. But God is inviting us to look at it and then with him to step in. I want to finish this first talk with a personal story which I hope some of you will find helpful. In December, I realized that I really needed spiritual feeding, but I couldn't get away on retreat. So I signed up for the first time ever for a retreat at home. And it turned out to be, surprisingly, one of the most fruitful retreats I've ever had. On the penultimate day, the prayer exercise I was given was to be imaginatively present with the women at the foot of the cross, something I've always found very hard to do. So I did what I often do when I'm a bit stuck. I turned to paintings on my tablet to help me, and came across one that I'd never seen before, Christ on the Cross, by an artist called Francisco de Zubarian. It had a profound effect on me. This, word for word, is what I wrote in my journal. This image, Jesus' expression, speaks not so much of Christ dying for us as of Christ dying with us. Of Jesus' suffering on the cross being much more to do with Emmanuel, God with us, than some super-duper act of wiping away our sins. Not that it isn't that too. But what I see is the love that becomes us in our suffering, in our crucifixions, in my God, why have you forsaken me? The painting says, this is how much I love you. Come home, Alison, to this love and recognize it. And I feel wounded and sad and loved and so stupid and foolish all at the same time. And I want to respond by going out and loving all the people who are hurting like this. No one should suffer like this. And Jesus chose to do so that we would never be alone. We would never be alone. I know that some of you here today have known real suffering during the pandemic. Some of you have had COVID badly. Some of you may still be suffering from long COVID. Some of you have lost family members, close friends, members of your congregations. You've had to take funerals, dreary things very often, miserable things, under severe lockdown rules. Some of you have struggled with darkness and depression. I read you that part from my journal because the most important thing to say is that Christ is Emmanuel, God with us in all that we've been going through and are going through. I also want to say that in my opinion, you have all kept the faith. You're here today, aren't you? You have kept going despite the difficulties and darkness. You are no judge of how well or how badly you've done. It's nothing to do with how good or bad you feel. If you felt you did it badly and you still struggle to do it, well, bravo for you. That takes more courage than if it's all smooth and easy running. Like the long-distance runner, you've gritted your teeth and you've kept the faith. For the future, and it feels very uncertain at the moment, we are invited to keep going with keeping the faith with God through Christ, who was in all things as we are, save sin. We are invited to keep the faith through Jesus, who, having loved his disciples, loved them to the end. We are invited to keep the faith by paying attention to our relationships with our God, who loves us to death. And the best way I know how to do that is to pray. Amen.